Fairly recently, I uncovered a gold mine. Not a literal gold mine, that would probably have made the news, but I uncovered a personal gold mine, a trove of memories forgotten. I uncovered an old email account from about 15 years ago that I had used as an archive of sorts. You see, at that time I was just about finishing my philosophy degree, and I enjoyed pretending that I might one day be a good writer of words. What a good writer of words might even call an author. Looking back now at what I wrote at the time, I see that I was not very good at it, and I regularly prove today I didn't really get any better. But the advantage of having that mindset at that time was that I would use short stories as a way to explore some of the heavy philosophy stuff that I was thinking about at the time, and now I get to go back over them again. One such short story was called The Man Who Never Died. You might expect, and you'd be right, that this was a short story about someone who didn't die. I go through some ideas about what might happen to such a person in a clumsy writing style that never really explores the topics I obviously wanted to explore as fully as I obviously wanted to. We'll get back to what those topics are shortly though, as it reveals something else to me. You see, I distinctly recall that the inspiration for writing that story was that I had recently heard for the first time that the first person to live to 1,000 years old may already, at that point 15 years ago, be alive. This is a suggestion that appears to have been first made by Aubrey de Grey, the British gerontologist, initially in 2008, which would have been around a year before I wrote my short story. And it's a suggestion that was surprising in 2008, mostly because of how plausible it was. Now in 2024, it hasn't gotten any less plausible, and there is constant news about discoveries in the field of gerontology that make the possibility ever more likely. Over just the last couple of months, I could pull up plenty of examples of current research to identify the causes of aging and age-related diseases. It's an area of very active research, and one which gets vast amounts of funding. Indeed, if we are ever going to have a person living to 1,000 years old, then it isn't out of the question at all that they are alive today. But the entire notion leaves me wondering, why? Why would anyone want to live that long? What would happen to someone who did? Well, anyway, let's return to that crappy story I wrote. In it, I wanted to explore a handful of topics related to the idea of this hypothetical 1,000-year-old man. And so it featured a narrator, not me but close enough, meeting a man who could be 1,000 years old, although he isn't sure. That lack of surety of memory is in fact a feature of the story. So, my main assertion, the overarching theme if you like, is that in a life that goes far beyond what is considered normal, the way our memories functioned would fail. The old man in the story laments a decline in his ability to create memories and an unreliability of the memories he can recall. I seem to give three main reasons as to why this occurred for the man. The first, that it was difficult for the man to gain sufficient intensity of a memory due to how short a time a human event occurs in, relative to the length of the man's life. Secondly, I assert that there is nothing sufficiently new that could happen to him, and I'm therefore suggesting that newness relates in some way to the formation of memories. Thirdly, I suggest that there is a repeating, blinding madness that the old man succumbs to, which nulls his consciousness for its duration. Now, I won't be covering that last topic in this video. Suffice it to say that it was a reflection on what I was trying to, and ultimately failed at, dealing with at the time I was writing. Maybe one day I'll be able to confront that sort of topic, but it takes a stronger mental constitution than I'm currently blessed with. But those first two topics can be covered. They are both concerns of the theme of time perception in general, and that is where I want to take this video. So, stay with me while I take a look at the perception of time, and along the way we'll see if I was justified in my assertions from that story. The topic of temporal perception has been a hot topic in philosophy, perhaps unsurprisingly, for millennia, probably since a human could be called a human. The 4th to 5th century philosopher St. Augustine of Hippo was concerned enough in this topic to include it as part of his prayers that make up the content of his confessions. "I still do not know what time is," he said. "Yet I confess too that I do know that I am saying this in time. that I have been talking about time for a long time, and that this long time would not be a long time if it were not for the fact that time has been passing all the while. St. Augustine alludes here to something interesting about the concept of time perception, and the position we need to start from when talking on the topic. When we attempt to understand time, we always do so from within the thing we are trying to perceive, and it simply won't stay still. This probably isn't surprising to anyone who has thought about the topic, but this makes it a difficult thing to analyse. We can't just take a snippet of time that has passed and treat it like an object to be analysed, and expect that it is the same as analysing the time that we experience. Time passed is not the same as time lived. I'm already having trouble speaking on the topic with clarity, so I'm going to start deferring to some more talented minds that have covered the issue of time perception. The first thinker we'll take a look at is William James, a psychologist from the era when psychology was just becoming a distinct discipline of philosophy. He wrote a grand work named Principles of Psychology, published in 1890, that covers, well, a lot, but it sets out his views on the perception of time rather neatly. To cut his long story short, however, it is a fair summary to suggest that James focused on the perception of time in something called the specious present, that is, a sensation of lived experience that includes the present, the series of nows that we recognise as happening to us, yet also includes the recent past, which is those few seconds that we have just experienced, and also the moments of the future that we are about to experience. He says, "We are constantly conscious of a certain duration, the specious present, varying in length from a few seconds to probably not more than a minute, and that this duration, with its content perceived as having one part earlier and the other part later, is the original intuition of time." That brief length of time that counts as the specious present, then, is what we might call our conscious perception of the passing of time. It is time as lived by us. As an example, imagine that you suddenly decide to make a nice hot beverage. You lock that in as a current project for yourself. Well, take a snapshot at any point in carrying out that project, and let's ask where our consciousness is. The water is still boiling. Then your consciousness is all at once on the fact of the present boiling of the water, on the recent past of the water heating up, and on the near future of the water being poured. In James's view, as consciousness navigates time, we have a constant changing of the specious present as moments in the past are discarded and moments of the future are brought in. The now will soon be the pouring, the recent past will be the boiling, and the near future the stopping pouring. A measure of a few seconds of consciousness are always retained in order to, as James says, give that continuity to consciousness without which it could not be called a stream. And so the stream ever moves on, and a lived conscious experience is manifested from it. So, the stream of consciousness that we might equate to our lived experience, life as lived, is very much rooted in the constant passage of time, in the present now and its immediate horizons. Yet, we are, obviously, much more than that immediate perception. I am, in some way, the same person who wrote that story 15 years ago. I am the person who studied philosophy at that time, and I am the person who owns some of the memories associated with that time. These things that I can point to as part of me are all outside of that horizon of the now that James calls the specious present, yet they are the definition to my person. Given the topic of my story, this is a point of great pertinence. The 1,000-year-old man is struggling with his memories, outside his specious present. He laments that there is insufficient intensity in his experiences to create new memories. To explore the concept of intensity, then, we should look to a new philosopher. The French philosopher Henri Bergson examines time in his 1889 work, Time and Free Will, an essay on the immediate data of consciousness. In it, he first establishes the notion of intensity as that quality of sensation that we quantify in perception of it. That is, we examine an intensity with respect to its magnitude compared to other intensities. As an example, he says, thus, the ticking of a watch seems louder at night because it easily monopolises a consciousness almost empty of sensations and ideas. As much as this quantification is a part of our perception of it, however, Bergson insists that the intensity itself is pure quality. In the second part of his essay, he expands on this by clearly defining two types of time, one time as we experience it, and the other time as a mathematical object. Time, when categorised, when analysed, Bergson suggests, is not time at all, but a kind of space, in which we quantify the moments of lived experience and arrange them alongside each other as if we are placing ornaments along a shelf. It is in this categorisation in what Bergson calls homogeneous time, where the intensities we experience are given a magnitude by which they may be compared. Actual time, that which is experienced in the now, is named duration by Bergson. In duration, there is no categorisation, no quantification, as that transfers time into space. There is only the pure quality of experience. Pure duration, Bergson says, is the form which the succession of our conscious states assumes when our ego lets itself live, when it refrains from separating its present state from its former states. In the name of completeness, I should say that the final of the three main parts of his essay is an assertion of free will, using the points he has established, suggesting that it is in the pure quality of the duration where free will occurs, despite the appearances of a determinism that come with the categorisation of homogeneous time. Now, we don't need to really cover that for our purposes, so let's wheel back to what is relevant to us. Intensity is, essentially, that which is experienced, the sensation or the quality of the things we experience. To say more is to fundamentally alter what it is, and yet we must do so to describe it. We change the intensity as experienced in pure duration into a categorised magnitude in that kind of space that Bergson calls homogeneous time. Once categorised, we can compare the magnitude of that intensity with other intensities, and it becomes a measure in the normal sense of the word intensity. Something is more intense if the magnitude of it is greater than other intensities. It may be reasonable to suggest then that a memory is formed by a sufficient intensity. In order for a memory to form, the present state of consciousness must, when reflected upon in homogeneous time, be of a sufficient magnitude to stand out from the rest of consciousness that has been pushed back into that arithmetically organised space. Now, we might imagine that your most joyful moment stands out because it ranks most high on the scale of joy. Your most painful moment stands out on the scale of pain. But can I suggest that, like in my story, an intense moment cannot occur without enough time relative to the life it is experienced within? Bergson hints at the idea. Pure consciousness does not perceive time as a sum of units of duration. Left to itself, it has no means and even no reason to measure time. But a feeling which lasted only half the number of days, for example, would no longer be the same feeling for it. It would lack thousands of impressions, which gradually thickened its substance and altered its colour. Okay, so Bergson is maybe hinting at something a little different here. He is suggesting that a similar experience, experienced in a shorter amount of time, becomes a different impression in memory. And again, what does reducing an interval of time mean except emptying or impoverishing the conscious states which fill it? Bergson unfortunately does not, at least anywhere I have found, address my question directly. But he does here explicitly claim that an intensity would require a certain length of duration for it to become sufficiently intense. I don't think it's entirely unreasonable to suggest, however, that because a longer life, much longer than our own, receives many times more impressions, then the magnitude conferred by an otherwise sufficient length of duration could become altered in our perception of it, in our recollection of it. More magnitude required where less would have otherwise sufficed. Bear in mind, I'm spatialising something which is not space in adding a length to duration. Lived experience has no magnitude during its process, only when recollected. So, am I satisfied that the formation of a memory requires a certain length of time relative to total lifetime? Not quite, but we'll return to that point shortly. The other point my story made was that there would need to be a sufficient level of newness for a memory to form. Let's pick up another thinker to examine this idea. Edmund Husserl tackled the topic of time perception in his series of lectures from 1904 to 2005, published later, along with some useful addenda, as The Phenomenology of Internal Time Consciousness. In it, he follows James and Bergson in detailing the horizon surrounding the now in which consciousness lives. Never an instant, but a small span of time from which the flow of consciousness can be manifested. He names retention as the part of the immediate past that we are currently holding on to as a frame of reference for the current now. He also gives a new word, as phenomenologists are wont to do, in protension, which is the immediate future that we experience in the now as an anticipation of our future actions. In a snapshot of time consciousness, retention and protension surround the instant of that consciousness. That instant, the now lived experience before its categorization, Husserl names the primal impression. It is the point at which the objective world that exists before our perception of it touches the subject. It is an impression like a cat's paw on freshly poured concrete. This is, in my opinion, a reasonable basic definition of phenomenology. It is an examination of how the world of phenomenal objects, that which exists, is able to interact with the subject, that which experiences. As a phenomenology, Husserl's work is, in all places, therefore, grounded in the concept of intentionality. That is, how that experiencing consciousness is always directed towards an external object, making that object into a thing of significance for the subject. Here, object might refer just as well to an abstract concept than to a solid material thing. This is the case also in time consciousness, where the intention towards an anticipated object offers meaning to the present moment of lived experience, and the remembrances of the past that are intersecting with that present moment. That intention is not simply like a meta-narrative to our lived consciousness, but it becomes an essential part of the primal impression, carried along with the other features of an impression into the past once a moment is no longer. And by this process, we are introduced to the role of memory in time consciousness. While retention is the immediate past, still connected to the present impression, by Husserl's reckoning, those more distant pieces of the past that are beyond what we could call retention are still inextricably linked to the present. Every act of memory, he says, contains intentions of expectation whose fulfillment leads to the present. The intentionality of the consciousness of that past primal impression is met in the present that recollects that past impression. It is not the case that once recollected, a memory is a fixed entity that is always the same on every successive recollection. The constant change of a perceptive consciousness is a constant creation of fresh framing on what may be perceived in any form, including the type of perception that we name recollection or memory. As an essential a priori phenomenological formation, Husserl says, memory is in a continuous flux because conscious life is in a constant flux and is not merely fitted member by member into the chain. So, this is all well and good, but what does it have to do with the role of newness in memory formation? Well, we have established that the present, the lived experience, is still linked to past impressions, memories, and is still shaped by them, even as it defines them anew with relation to its current intentionalities. What we have not established, though, is why one such primal impression should become recollectable over another. One point I'd like us to assume is that the thoroughly mundane is unlikely to induce a recollectable impression. You are unlikely to give detail on the second cup of coffee you had on the last Tuesday of January, if a second cup of coffee is an act carried out every day over years. It's too mundane, too unoriginal. You may still remember the first time you had a cup of coffee, even 30 years after it happened, maybe not as a flawless recollection, but likely as a blurry symbolism of what coffee drinking means to you. If we allow for the role of intentionality in our time consciousness, as Husserl suggests, then I think we can suggest that if our lived experience is always as expected, simply meeting the expectations set forth by our intentions, then that living present will often pass by without note. When something unique, novel, or frankly unexpected happens to us, then the primal impression must be reconciled with our previous intentions, reorienting us towards the world in a way that had not been a factor before that impression touched our subject. And once impressed so, it impresses upon first the retentions of the next primal impression, then on the recollections of it in some future primal impression. A novel experience, in a sense, arrests the normal flow of consciousness that your intentionality had set forth in front of you. It is like, after pouring a fresh concrete driveway, a cat comes along and sets her paw into your concrete, forever changing it. You wanted a nice smooth concrete driveway, and all your conscious actions up to this point were in service of that intention. Then the unexpected happens, and the new intention is of a mostly smooth concrete driveway that also acts as a loving memorial to your cat. I'd hazard a guess that in recollection years later, the memory of making that driveway is the memory of the cat changing your intentions. Before I leave this section behind, I will note that I didn't find Husserl explicitly making these claims, yet I do think they follow from his assertions. The idea that newness has a more lasting impression in our memories is a somewhat known phenomenon in cognitive science, though, known as either the isolation effect or the von Restorff effect, after the German psychiatrist who first proposed the theory, Hedwig von Restorff. Before I started research for this video, I had not heard of the title of this theory, but I was certainly familiar with its proposal. Whether it's simply common sense or commonly adopted sense, I'm not sure, but von Restorff managed to get her name associated with the phenomena either way, and should therefore be recognised for her contribution. Okay, so let's take a moment to gather our thoughts and our thinkers together. William James gave us the psychological framework to understand how we experience the passage of time, and further, how our stream of consciousness is analogous to that experience. That consciousness can be called a present, but in fact there is a horizon of the just past and the soon-to-be in every specious present. Bergson introduced the concept of intensity as that quality of sensation in the horizon of the present experience, the duration. That intensity becomes a mathematical quantity in our memory of it, and by that quantification we measure our past experiences, our memories, against each other. Finally, Husserl, the father of phenomenology, appropriately did a phenomenology, and described the point where the objective world touches the subject in the consciousness of time. Husserl expanded on the horizon of the present, the primal impression with its retentions and protensions, to argue that our intention stretches further towards the future and towards the memories of the past, with ever fresh interpretations and meaning being born from the interplay of all kinds of experienced time. Did these thinkers help to answer the questions I had raised in my short story? Well, they certainly offered the space to reflect on those questions, and I certainly treated these thinkers as malleable entities ready to be moulded to the answer I wanted. But neither James, Bergson nor Husserl were writing with the concept of a 1,000-year-old person in mind. Bergson did suggest that at least a certain amount of time is required to create a memory of any particular intensity, as well he might. A microsecond of pain is barely registered as an experience, while a few seconds certainly is. James also suggested as much, by the way, when he wrote, "For a state of mind to survive in memory, it must have endured for a certain length of time." Bergson didn't make any suggestion that the length of time needs to be a sufficient length relative to the whole of a lifetime, though. And why would he? Is there any indication that a 40-year-old requires a greater length of time than a 20-year-old for an impression to embed itself in our memory? Not that I'm aware of, but then I'm at the wrong end of that equation, so maybe I just haven't spent long enough being aware of it. Husserl didn't make any explicit assertion that novelty, uniqueness, or an unusual quality of experience makes the formation of a memory more likely. But then, did he really need to? This feels today like common sense, and even if it has only been common sense since von Restorff's study, it was unlikely to be a surprise to Husserl. In truth then, why did I appeal to the ideas of these thinkers? I guess I wanted to explore what is the perception of time, and whether there was an indication that total time lived was important to that perception. In the life of a toddler, an hour can feel like an eternity, and maybe an adult does not experience this eternity, so what then of a super adult? Except, maybe he does experience this eternity if he sits watching the time pass in boredom. What this examination has showed me is that the perception of time is in that part of time that our consciousness lives. It is in the present now, and the parts of the immediate past and future that are required to provide a coherent meaning to our conscious life. Beyond that, the mathematical, maybe even spatial time in which our memories are categorized is nice to have, simply a bonus. More than that, perhaps. Our memories do, in a very real sense, define us and dictate to ourselves a coherent identity. Yet, if we are constantly reinterpreting our recollections with reference to an ever-changing flux of intentions, then what does it matter how reliable those recollections used in that process are? What does it matter if they aren't there at all? Maybe it doesn't matter at all. My story certainly overemphasizes the need for infallible recall, when really there may be no such thing. I think I'm left, at the end of this examination, willing to say that my concerns about what will happen to the consciousness of someone with such an extended life are really unfounded. I have to admit that my concerns are largely to do with how horrified I am at the prospect of such a long life. I'm firmly in the who wants to live forever camp. I'll gladly take on the medical advances and improve my quality of life, reduce the chance of some of the scariest age-related diseases, and I might always prefer an end tomorrow rather than today. But an end must come. I think that if we genuinely get to the point where a type of immortality is possible, then what it means to be human will significantly change. But isn't that the nature of humanity anyway? On reflection of human history, the only thing more startling than the human capacity for rapid change is how we assimilate that change into our everyday without really stopping to consider it. Just think on this for a moment. In my relatively short life, we've seen an average human become a member of an augmented species. In explicit terms, with crude cybernetics like the diabetes glucose monitoring and insulin delivery systems, which I have permanently attached to my body. And in implicit terms, the average person nowadays walks around with a supercomputer that can answer any question they can think of and enhances communications far beyond what we might think of as natural to our species. My discovery of that gold mine that I started this video talking about is just another example of all this. We do not need to keep the memories that we may wish to reflect on internal to us. We have already adopted augments to our mental faculties that will and have changed the way our memory functions. If a person alive today lives for another 1,000 years, then they may only need to select the right memory archive, like an old email inbox, to remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.